The white satin dress dragged through the autumn mud as Jessica stumbled down the church steps, her face streaked with tears and mascara. Behind her, the ornate doors of St. Mary's Cathedral burst open, releasing the shocked gasps and horrified whispers of 300 wedding guests. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tom Henderson was loading his toolbox into his pickup truck across the street when he heard the commotion. He had been working late at the auto repair shop next to the cathedral, trying to finish a transmission job before the weekend when the sound of screaming pierced the quiet October evening. What he saw next would haunt him for weeks. A young woman in an elaborate wedding gown was running barefoot across the wet pavement, her pregnant belly visible beneath the flowing fabric. She collapsed beside his truck, sobbing uncontrollably, while behind her, a man in a tuxedo shouted words that made Tom's blood run cold. The man was chasing after her, his face twisted with rage, screaming about family reputation and obligations. But it was what the woman cried out in response that stopped Tom's heart completely. She turned to face her pursuer and screamed through her tears that she would rather die than marry her own brother. Tom had lived in Riverside, Oregon his entire life. He had seen plenty of drama unfold in their small town of 8,000 people, divorce proceedings that turned neighbors into enemies, custody battles that split families apart, business deals that destroyed friendships built over decades. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, standing in the church parking lot on a drizzly Thursday evening, watching a pregnant bride flee from what appeared to be the most twisted wedding ceremony in the town's history. Tom Henderson had never planned on being a single father, much less raising his 7-year-old son Lucas in the small apartment above his auto repair shop. Life had handed him circumstances that required adaptation rather than choice. His wife, Maria, had died in a car accident 3 years ago, leaving him to navigate parenthood alone while maintaining the business that barely kept them afloat. At 32, Tom carried himself with the quiet strength of a man who had learned to solve problems with his hands and his heart, approaching each challenge with methodical patience. The garage that served as both his livelihood and his identity occupied a corner lot on Riverside's main street, directly across from St. Mary's Cathedral. The irony was not lost on him that his diesel-stained workspace faced the town's most elegant house of worship. While wealthy families celebrated life's milestones in marble halls and stained glass windows, Tom spent his days underneath broken-down vehicles, coaxing life back into engines that others had given up on. The contrast between these two worlds had never seemed more apparent than on this particular Thursday evening. Lucas possessed an unusual gift for reading people's emotions, a sensitivity that Tom attributed to the trauma of losing his mother at such a young age. The boy could sense tension in adults before they recognized it themselves, offering comfort with an intuition that seemed far beyond his years. Teachers at Riverside Elementary frequently commented on Lucas's ability to help classmates through difficult moments, describing him as an old soul wrapped in the enthusiasm of childhood. Tom often wondered if this emotional intelligence was his son's way of processing grief, transforming personal pain into compassion for others. The afternoon had been typical for Tom's auto repair, with 3 oil changes, a brake job, and the challenging transmission replacement that had kept him working past his usual closing time. Lucas sat at the small desk in the corner of the garage, completing homework assignments while occasionally offering observations about the customers who visited throughout the day.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The boy had developed a routine of greeting each client with genuine interest, asking about their families and remembering details from previous visits that often surprised adults who assumed children paid little attention to grown-up conversations. Tom had been wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag, preparing to close the garage for the evening when the commotion began across the street. The cathedral had been busy all day with wedding preparations, elegant cars arriving to deliver flowers and catering supplies. Tom had noticed the activity but paid little attention, accustomed to the steady stream of ceremonies that provided a peaceful backdrop to his daily work. Riverside's wealthy families often chose St. Mary's for their celebrations, creating temporary islands of luxury that briefly transformed the modest downtown area. The woman's desperate flight from the cathedral steps shattered the evening's tranquility in ways that Tom could never have anticipated. Her wedding dress, which must have cost more than Tom earned in several months, was now torn and muddy from her frantic escape. She had managed to make it halfway across the street before stumbling, her hands instinctively protecting her pregnant belly as she fell. The sight of her vulnerability awakened every protective instinct that Tom possessed, overriding the social barriers that typically separated his world from the affluent families who frequented the cathedral. Lucas had rushed to the garage's open doorway when he heard the woman crying, his young face showing the same concern that he typically reserved for injured animals or upset classmates. Tom watched his son's reaction carefully, knowing that the boy's emotional radar was picking up signals that adults might miss. The child's immediate impulse to help, combined with Tom's own moral compass, made the decision to intervene feel inevitable rather than chosen. The man pursuing the pregnant bride wore a tuxedo that probably cost more than Tom's monthly rent, but his expensive clothes could not disguise the cruelty in his voice as he shouted threats and demands. Tom had encountered bullies before, men who used wealth or position to intimidate others, but this situation felt different. The desperation in the woman's voice, the way she clutched her belly protectively, the raw terror in her eyes as she looked back at her pursuer, all suggested that much more than a wedding was at stake. Tom's decision to step forward and place himself between the pregnant woman and her tormentor was made without conscious deliberation. Some situations required action rather than analysis, and the scene unfolding in the church parking lot was clearly one of them. As he approached the couple, Tom noticed other details that painted a disturbing picture of what had transpired inside the cathedral. Wedding guests were emerging from the building, their expressions showing shock and confusion rather than celebration. Several older women were crying, while men in expensive suits spoke in urgent whispers, their faces grave with concern that suggested this was far more than a typical wedding dispute. Tom stepped between Jessica and the man in the tuxedo, his work boots finding solid purchase on the wet asphalt. The stranger was taller than Tom by several inches, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of expensive barbers and tailored clothing. But there was something unsettling about his eyes. They held a coldness that Tom had only seen once before, in the face of a man who had beaten his dog so severely that neighbors called the police. This was not anger born from disappointment or embarrassment. This was something darker, more calculating. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Tom asked Jessica, keeping his voice calm while maintaining eye contact with her pursuer. She was trembling so violently that her bouquet of white roses scattered petals across the pavement with each shaky breath. Her wedding dress, which had probably taken months to select and fit, was now stained with mud and torn at the hem where she had caught it fleeing down the cathedral steps. It was her face that broke Tom's heart. She looked like a trapped animal, eyes darting between Tom and the man behind him, searching for an escape route that didn't seem to exist. "She's fine," the man in the tuxedo declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his words accepted without question. "This is a family matter that doesn't concern you, mechanic." The way he pronounced Tom's profession made it sound like an insult, each syllable dripping with the kind of contempt that wealthy people reserved for those they considered beneath their station. "Jessica, get back inside immediately. Our guests are waiting, and you're making a spectacle of yourself." Jessica's response was barely a whisper, but Tom heard every word with crystal clarity. "I can't marry him, Tom. I can't do this anymore." The fact that she knew his name surprised him until he remembered that she had probably seen his business sign countless times while attending services at the cathedral. But hearing her speak his name with such desperate familiarity created an instant connection that transcended their obvious social differences. "You absolutely can, and you will," the man snapped, reaching past Tom to grab Jessica's wrist. Tom intercepted the movement smoothly, his mechanic's reflexes allowing him to catch the stranger's arm before contact could be made. The man's skin was soft,
unmarked by physical labor, but his grip was surprisingly strong as he tried to push past Tom's interference. "I don't think the lady wants to go with you," Tom said quietly, applying just enough pressure to the man's wrist to demonstrate that he was not easily intimidated. Years of wrestling with stubborn engine parts and lifting heavy equipment had given Tom a strength that his modest frame didn't advertise, and he could feel the other man's surprise as his advance was halted so effortlessly. That's when Lucas appeared at Tom's side, his small hand slipping into his father's free one. The boy looked up at Jessica with the same concerned expression he wore when he found injured birds in their small backyard garden. "Dad, the lady is scared," Lucas observed with the directness that only children possessed. "Her baby is scared too. I can feel it." The man in the tuxedo laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "A child's imagination. Jessica, stop this nonsense immediately. Think about what you're doing to our family's reputation. Think about the shame you're bringing on everyone who loves you." His words were carefully chosen, designed to manipulate through guilt rather than force, but Tom recognized the technique from his own childhood experiences with an emotionally abusive stepfather. "What's your name?" Tom asked the stranger directly, maintaining his protective position between the man and Jessica. If this situation was going to escalate, he needed to understand exactly who he was dealing with and what kind of power dynamics were at play. "Ryan Morrison," the man replied, straightening his tie with the kind of precise movement that suggested obsessive attention to appearance. "Of the Morrison construction family. Perhaps you've heard of us, though I doubt our business circles overlap." Morrison Construction was indeed well known throughout Oregon, responsible for most of the luxury developments that had transformed Riverside from a working-class lumber town into a destination for wealthy retirees and second homeowners. Jessica's sob interrupted Ryan's self-introduction. "Tell him, Ryan. Tell him who you really are to me." Her voice carried a challenge that seemed to drain the color from Ryan's face, replacing his arrogant confidence with something that looked almost like panic. Tom felt the tension shift in a way that suggested he was about to learn information that would make this situation far more complicated than a simple runaway bride scenario. "Jessica, be very careful about what you say next," Ryan warned, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow sounded more threatening than his previous shouting. "There are things that should remain private, family matters that outsiders
Possibly understand. Think about your future. Think about the baby's future." "The baby?" Lucas asked with innocent curiosity, looking up at Jessica's pregnant form with the kind of wonder that children typically reserved for Christmas morning. "When is your baby coming? My mom had a baby before she went to heaven, but the baby went with her. Dad says they're both watching over us now." Jessica knelt down despite her wedding dress, bringing herself to Lucas's eye level with an effort that clearly caused her physical discomfort. "Your mom sounds like she was very special, Lucas. I'm sure she loved you very much." Her voice was gentle now, the hysteria fading as she focused on comforting a child rather than confronting her own crisis. Tom watched this interaction with growing understanding of his son's unusual ability to defuse tense situations through simple compassion. Lucas had somehow managed to create a moment of calm in what had been an increasingly volatile confrontation, allowing Jessica to regain some composure while forcing Ryan to moderate his behavior in front of a child. "The baby is coming in January," Jessica told Lucas, one hand resting protectively on her belly. "I'm scared about being a good mom, though. I don't know if I'm strong enough." Her admission revealed a vulnerability that seemed to surprise even her, as if speaking honestly after months of pretense was both relief and terrifying exposure. "My dad is really good at taking care of people," Lucas offered with the absolute confidence that children have in their parents' abilities. "He fixed Mrs. Patterson's car for free when her husband got sick, and he always makes sure I eat vegetables, even when I don't want to. Maybe he could help you figure out how to take care of your baby, too." Ryan's reaction to Lucas's innocent suggestion was immediate and harsh,
That will not be necessary. Jessica has family support and resources that your father couldn't possibly provide. This child doesn't understand the complexities of adult situations. His dismissal of Lucas carried the same casual cruelty that Tom had heard in his earlier treatment of Jessica, confirming Tom's growing suspicion that Ryan Morrison was accustomed to controlling people through intimidation and condescension. Actually, I think children often understand more than adults give them credit for. Lucas has a gift for seeing what really matters in situations like this. Maybe we should listen to what he's trying to tell us. Jessica stood up slowly, using the side of Tom's truck for support as she struggled with the weight of her pregnancy and the bulk of her elaborate dress. Lucas is right. I don't know how to take care of anyone, including myself. I've been so focused on doing what my family expects that I've forgotten how to think about what I actually want or need. Her confession seemed to strengthen her resolve rather than weaken it, as if acknowledging her fears allowed her to face them more directly. "What you need is to honor your commitments," Ryan interjected, but his words lacked the commanding authority they had carried earlier. Something about the presence of Lucas and Tom's unwavering support for Jessica was undermining his ability to maintain control through verbal manipulation alone. The cathedral doors opened again, releasing a small group of well-dressed older adults who approached the parking lot with obvious reluctance. Tom recognized the body language of people who were being forced to confront a situation they would prefer to avoid entirely. Their expensive clothes and jewelry marked them as members of Riverside's wealthy elite, but their expressions showed the kind of distress that money couldn't solve. "Jessica, darling, please come back inside," called an older woman whose resemblance to Jessica suggested a family relationship. "We can work this out privately without involving strangers in our personal business." Her plea carried genuine emotion, but Tom noticed that she didn't approach too closely, as if maintaining physical distance would somehow contain the damage to their family's reputation. "Mom, I can't do this," Jessica replied, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I won't do this. Not anymore. Not ever." The finality in her tone seemed to surprise everyone present, including herself. For the first time since Tom had witnessed her flight from the cathedral, Jessica sounded like someone making her own decisions rather than reacting to circumstances beyond her control. Lucas tugged on his father's sleeve, drawing Tom's attention down to his son's upturned face. "Dad, why does everyone look so sad at a wedding? Aren't weddings supposed to be happy?" The child's question cut through the adult complications to expose the fundamental wrongness of the situation they were all witnessing. "Sometimes weddings happen for the wrong reasons, buddy," Tom explained gently, his words intended as much for Jessica as for his son. "Marriage should be about love and choosing to build a life together. When it's about other things, it makes everyone sad instead of happy." Jessica's mother approached more closely now, her carefully composed expression beginning to crack under the pressure of public exposure and private family crisis. "Jessica, think about what you're doing. Think about the consequences. There are obligations, responsibilities that go beyond your personal feelings. The family has invested so much in this union, and canceling now would create problems that extend far beyond just you and Ryan." "Obligations to who?" Jessica asked, her voice rising with each word. "To Ryan? To you and Dad? To people I barely know who care more about business deals than about whether I'm happy or safe?" Her question seemed to surprise her mother, as if the older woman had never considered that Jessica might challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying their family's expectations. The weight of unspoken secrets hung heavy in the cathedral parking lot as more family members emerged from the ornate doors. Tom counted at least 15 people now gathered on the steps, their faces a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and barely contained panic. Whatever Jessica had fled from inside that building involved far more than a simple case of cold feet. The elaborate nature of the wedding, the expensive clothes, the obvious wealth of everyone involved suggested that significant business interests were at stake beyond just personal relationships. Jessica's father appeared among the group on the cathedral steps, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the chaos of the evening. Even from across the parking lot, Tom could see the man's resemblance to his daughter. But where Jessica's features carried softness and vulnerability, her father's face was carved from granite determination. He descended the steps with measured precision, each footfall deliberate as he approached the confrontation that was unfolding beside Tom's pickup truck. "Jessica Marie Morrison," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his commands obeyed without question. "You will return to that altar immediately and complete the ceremony that has been planned for months. Do you have any idea what you're putting this family through? What you're putting your mother through?" Morrison. Tom's mind processed this information with growing unease. Jessica and Ryan shared the same last name, but that could mean marriage or family connection. In a small town like Riverside, prominent families often intermarried to consolidate wealth and business interests. But something about the way Ryan had reacted to Jessica's earlier challenge suggested a relationship more complicated than typical family business arrangements.
Lucas had been unusually quiet during the escalating confrontation, but now he looked up at Tom with the serious expression he wore when trying to work through problems beyond his 7-year-old understanding. "Dad, why does the man in the fancy clothes have the same name as the lady in the wedding dress? Are they already married?" "Nobody, they're not married," Tom replied carefully, his mechanic's instincts telling him that Lucas had identified a crucial detail that the adults were all dancing around. "Sometimes people have the same last name for different reasons." "Like brothers and sisters?" Lucas asked with innocent directness that made several of the adults visibly uncomfortable. "My friend Jimmy says brothers and sisters can't get married because that would be weird and wrong." The silence that followed Lucas's observation was deafening. Tom watched the color drain from Jessica's face, while Ryan's jaw tightened with barely controlled rage. Jessica's parents exchanged a look that confirmed what Tom's growing suspicions had already suggested, but what his rational mind had refused to fully accept. "That's enough questions from the child," Jessica's father declared sharply. "This is an adult conversation about adult responsibilities. Young man, you need to remove your son from this situation before he hears things that might confuse him further." But Lucas wasn't finished processing the information his keen emotional intelligence was gathering from the adults around him. "The lady called the fancy man her brother when she was running away. But brothers don't marry sisters, right, Dad? That's what they teach us in school about families." Tom felt his stomach drop as the pieces of this nightmare scenario finally assembled into a complete picture. Jessica Morrison wasn't just fleeing from an unwanted marriage. She was fleeing from something far more twisted and wrong. The pregnancy, the family pressure, the business implications, the desperate terror in her voice when she had screamed about not marrying her brother. It all made horrible sense now. "Jessica," Tom said quietly, his voice steady despite the shock and revulsion coursing through his system. "Is Ryan your brother?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence, demanding acknowledgement of a truth that everyone present seemed determined to avoid confronting directly. Jessica's sob provided the answer before her words could form, her entire body shaking with the relief of finally having someone ask the question that cut through all the euphemisms and family obligations to the rotten core of what was being demanded of her. "He's my half-brother," she whispered, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of months of psychological torture. "Same father, different mothers. Dad remarried when I was 12 and Ryan was 16. We grew up in the same house for 6 years before I left for college." Her confession seemed to age her visibly, as if speaking the truth aloud was simultaneously liberating and exhausting. Tom's protective instincts, already heightened by the confrontation, now exploded into full-scale alarm.
This wasn't just about social pressure or family expectations. This was about fundamental violations of human decency and legal boundaries. That Jessica's pregnancy was a horrifying indication of crimes that extended far beyond what was happening in this parking lot. Jesus Christ, Tom muttered under his breath, immediately regretting the language in front of Lucas, but unable to contain his shock and disgust. Jessica, this isn't a wedding, this is a cover-up. Ryan stepped forward aggressively, his polished facade finally cracking to reveal the predator beneath. You have no idea what you're interfering with, mechanic. This family has more resources and connections than you could possibly imagine. I suggest you take your boy and disappear before you find yourself dealing with problems that bankrupt businesses and destroy lives.
The threat was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for his actions, but it had exactly the opposite effect on Tom than Ryan intended. Instead of intimidation, Tom felt the kind of cold fury that had gotten him into trouble during his younger years, before marriage and fatherhood had taught him to channel his protective instincts more constructively. "Are you threatening my family?" Tom asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that made Lucas look up with concern. The boy had rarely seen his father truly angry, and the change in Tom's demeanor was clearly unsettling to a child who depended on his father's stability and control. "I'm explaining reality," Ryan replied smoothly. "Morrison Construction owns half the commercial real estate in this county. We have contracts with the city, relationships with banks, influence with people who make decisions about zoning and business licenses. Your little garage exists at our sufferance, and that sufferance can be withdrawn if you persist in interfering with private family matters." Jessica's father nodded approvingly at Ryan's words, clearly pleased that someone was finally addressing the practical realities of the situation. "The boy is right, mechanic. This family takes care of its own problems in its own way. What happens within our family is not subject to outside judgment or interference. Jessica will fulfill her responsibilities, and this unfortunate scene will be forgotten by everyone present." Tom looked around at the crowd of wedding guests, searching for any sign that someone else was as horrified by this revelation as he was. Instead, he saw carefully neutral expressions that suggested willful blindness to crimes being discussed in plain sight. These people had known. They had all known what this wedding really represented, and they had come dressed in their finest clothes to witness and legitimize what amounted to the continuation of systematic abuse. "You're all insane," Tom said flatly, his voice carrying across the parking lot with perfect clarity. "You're talking about covering up incest and sexual assault like it's a business decision. Jessica is pregnant with her brother's child, and you want her to marry him to hide the crime?" The words seemed to hit the gathered crowd like physical blows, causing several of the older women to gasp and clutch their pearls, while the men's faces hardened into expressions of barely contained violence. Tom realized that he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that speaking the truth aloud had made him a threat that this family would feel compelled to neutralize. Jessica's mother stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "That is quite enough. You clearly don't understand the complexities of our situation or the careful arrangements that have been made to protect everyone involved. Jessica's child will be born into a stable marriage, with financial security and social standing. What you're suggesting would destroy lives and accomplish nothing positive. What I'm suggesting is reporting crimes to the police and getting Jessica the help she needs to escape from people who have been abusing her. That baby she's carrying is evidence of rape, and this wedding is a conspiracy to cover it up." Lucas had been listening to this exchange with growing distress, his young mind struggling to process adult concepts that he wasn't emotionally equipped to handle. Now he tugged on Tom's jacket with increasing urgency, tears starting to form in his eyes as he sensed the danger building around his father. "Dad, let's go home," Lucas whispered, his voice shaky with fear. "I don't like these people. They make me feel scared inside, like when the thunderstorms get too loud." Tom's heart broke as he realized that his son was being traumatized by exposure to this family's dysfunction and violence. Everything in him wanted to gather Lucas and leave, to protect his child from witnessing the kind of evil that most 7-year-olds never encountered. But looking at Jessica's desperate face,
Seeing the hope that had flickered in her eyes when he had spoken the truth about her situation, Tom knew that walking away would be abandoning someone who had no other advocates or protectors. The decision was made for him when
Morrison pulled out his cell phone and made a call that Tom could partially overhear. The conversation was brief and conducted in the coded language of people accustomed to having their problems solved through connections rather than legal channels. When Ryan ended the call, his smile carried the confidence of someone whose threats were backed by real power. "Sheriff Peterson will be here in 10 minutes, Ryan announced to the assembled crowd. "We've had reports of a disturbed individual threatening wedding guests and attempting to kidnap the bride. I'm sure this unfortunate misunderstanding can be resolved quickly once proper authorities take control of the situation." Tom's blood ran cold as he realized the full scope of the trap that was closing around him. In a small town where the Morrison family owned significant property and employed dozens of people, their version of events would carry far more weight than the word of a mechanic with no political connections or social influence. Sheriff Peterson had probably known the Morrison family for decades, had likely benefited from their political contributions and community involvement in ways that would make him reluctant to investigate their private business too closely. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tense evening air as Tom realized he had perhaps 2 minutes to make a decision that would determine the trajectory of 3 lives. Sheriff Peterson's loyalty to the Morrison family was well known throughout Riverside, and once he arrived, any chance of helping Jessica escape would disappear into a maze of official reports and legal maneuvering that would favor wealth over justice. Tom's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his truck keys, knowing that what he was about to do would change everything. "Jessica, do you trust me?" Tom asked urgently, opening his passenger door while keeping one eye on Lucas, who was pressed against his leg with obvious fear. "I can't promise you everything will work out, but I can promise you won't have to face this alone anymore." Jessica's eyes darted between Tom's truck and the approaching police car, her mind clearly racing through options that all seemed to lead to different versions of the same trapped existence. The wedding dress that had once represented hope and new beginnings now felt like a costume in someone else's play, a role she had never chosen but had been forced to perform for an audience that cared nothing about her happiness or safety. "If I leave with you now, they'll destroy you," Jessica whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of understanding what her rescue would cost the man offering it. "The Morrison family doesn't forgive people who interfere with their plans. They'll ruin your business, take your home, make sure you can never work in this town again." "Let me worry about that," Tom replied, helping her into the passenger seat despite her protests. "Lucas, climb in the back seat and buckle up, buddy. We're going for a drive." His son obeyed immediately, his trust in his father's judgment absolute even in circumstances that clearly frightened him. The police car pulled into the Cathedral parking lot just as Tom's truck engine roared to life. Sheriff Peterson emerged from the vehicle with the casual confidence of a man who expected his presence alone to resolve whatever disturbance had been reported. His uniform was crisp and his badge polished, but his eyes held the weariness of someone who had learned to navigate the complicated politics of small-town law enforcement, where justice often took a back seat to maintaining social order. Ryan Morrison approached the sheriff with the smooth familiarity of someone who had conducted similar conversations many times before. Tom could see them talking through his rearview mirror as he backed out of the parking space, their body language suggesting a relationship built on mutual benefit rather than respect for legal principles. Peterson nodded gravely at whatever Ryan was telling him, his hand moving unconsciously to his radio as if preparing to call for backup. "Where are we going, Dad?"
Lucas asked from the back seat, his voice small but steady. Despite his fear, the boy seemed to understand that they were helping someone who needed their protection, and his natural empathy was overriding his anxiety about their sudden departure from everything familiar and safe. "Somewhere these people can't hurt anyone anymore," Tom replied, his jaw set with determination that surprised even him. He had never considered himself particularly courageous, but something about Jessica's situation had awakened protective instincts that made retreat feel impossible despite the personal cost. Jessica fumbled with her seatbelt, her hands shaking so violently that Tom had to help her secure it properly. "I don't have anywhere to go," she admitted, the reality of her situation hitting her as they drove away from the cathedral. I don't have money of my own, or friends outside the family's influence, or any skills that would let me support myself and a baby." "We'll figure it out," Tom promised, though he had no clear plan beyond getting Jessica away from immediate danger. His savings account contained barely enough to cover 2 months of expenses, and his garage operated on such thin margins that missing even a few days of work would create financial problems he couldn't easily solve. But looking at Lucas in the rearview mirror, seeing his son's face filled with concern for a stranger's welfare, Tom knew he was teaching his son a lesson about standing up for what's right that was worth any sacrifice. The truck's radio crackled with police communications as they drove through Riverside's quiet residential streets. Tom caught fragments of conversation about a kidnapping in progress and a dangerous individual who had threatened wedding guests. The official narrative was already being written, transforming his attempt to help an abuse victim into a criminal act that would justify whatever retaliation the Morrison family chose to pursue. "They're making me sound like a monster on the police radio," Tom told Jessica, his voice tight with anger at the injustice of being painted as a criminal for trying to protect someone from incest and forced marriage. "By tomorrow morning, everyone in town will believe I'm some kind of dangerous lunatic who disrupted a wedding and kidnapped the bride." Jessica listened to the radio chatter with growing horror, realizing that her rescue was coming at a price that she had never intended Tom to pay. "Stop the truck," she said suddenly, her voice firm with new resolve. "Let me out here. I'll go back and tell them I left voluntarily, that you were just trying to help. Maybe that will be enough to protect you and Lucas." "No," Tom replied without hesitation, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "You're not going back to those people. We'll find another way to handle this, but you're not sacrificing yourself to protect me. That's not how this works." Lucas spoke up from the back seat with the clarity that sometimes emerged from children when adults were too caught up in complicated emotions to see simple truths. "Dad, why don't we call the real police? The ones who don't know the bad people. Maybe they would help the lady and her baby." Tom's heart swelled with pride at his son's suggestion, realizing that Lucas had identified the crucial flaw in their situation. Sheriff Peterson's loyalty to the Morrison family didn't extend to state or federal law enforcement agencies that had no financial stake in protecting local business interests. There were authorities beyond the reach of small-town corruption who might take Jessica's situation seriously if it was presented properly. "Lucas, you're brilliant," Tom said, pulling into an empty parking lot behind the town's closed library. "Jessica, do you think you're strong enough to tell your story to investigators who aren't connected to your family? People who might actually do something to stop what's been happening to you?" Jessica was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting protectively on her pregnant belly as she considered the implications of officially reporting her family's crimes. "I've never told anyone the complete truth about what Ryan did to me, or how long it's been going on, or how many times my parents covered it up by sending me away to boarding school or summer camps whenever I threatened to speak up." The admission hung in the truck's interior like a physical presence, making clear that Jessica's pregnancy was not the result of a single assault, but the culmination of years of systematic abuse that her family had enabled through willful blindness and active cover-ups. Tom felt sick thinking about how many people had failed this young woman, how many adults had chosen social standing and financial security over protecting a child from predatory violence. "How old were you when it started?" Tom asked gently, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. 14, Jessica whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of trauma that had shaped years of her life. "Ryan was 18 and home from college for Christmas break. He said it was normal for family members to help each other learn about relationships, that it was our secret and would help me understand boys better when I started dating." Tom's vision actually blurred with rage as he processed Jessica's revelation, understanding that they were dealing with crimes that extended far beyond forced marriages into years of child sexual abuse that had been systematically covered up by parents who cared more about reputation than their daughter's welfare.
Lucas was too young to fully understand what Jessica was describing, but Tom could see in the rearview mirror that his son sensed the gravity of what was being discussed. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted Jessica's painful confession as multiple police cars converged on their location. Sheriff Peterson had apparently coordinated with other local departments to create a dragnet that would make escape impossible within Riverside city limits. Tom realized that staying in town was no longer an option if they wanted to reach authorities who might actually investigate Jessica's allegations rather than cover them up. Tom made a split-second decision that would define the rest of their lives. Instead of trying to outrun the local police, he drove straight to the state highway and called the FBI field office in Portland from Jessica's phone. Within an hour, federal agents were interviewing Jessica in a safe house while Tom and Lucas waited in a nearby hotel room, their future uncertain, but their consciences clear. The investigation that followed unraveled decades of Morrison family crimes that extended far beyond Jessica's abuse. Federal agents discovered financial fraud, tax evasion, and evidence that other young women had been victimized and silenced through intimidation and payoffs. Ryan Morrison was arrested within 48 hours, his arrogant confidence crumbling as he realized that his family's local influence meant nothing to federal prosecutors who specialized in organized crime and corruption. Sheriff Peterson found himself under investigation for obstruction of justice. His cozy relationship with the Morrison family suddenly transformed from political advantage to criminal liability. The wedding that was supposed to cover up crimes instead became the catalyst that exposed them to national scrutiny when news outlets picked up the story of a pregnant bride fleeing from her own brother at the altar. Jessica's courage in testifying against her family resulted in convictions that sent Ryan to federal prison for 15 years and her parents to state prison for child endangerment and conspiracy. The Morrison construction empire collapsed under the weight of criminal charges in civil lawsuits, their assets liquidated to pay restitution to victims who had been silenced for decades. Tom's auto repair shop became an unexpected symbol of moral courage when national media covered the story of a small-town mechanic who risked everything to protect an abuse victim from her powerful family. The publicity brought customers from across the state, people who wanted to support a business owner who had chosen principle over profit. His modest garage expanded into a thriving automotive center that employed a dozen people and served as an informal community hub. Jessica gave birth to a healthy daughter in February, surrounded by a chosen family that included Tom, Lucas, and the victim advocates who would become her support system during the legal proceedings. She named the baby Hope, a choice that reflected her determination to transform trauma into purpose and create a future defined by love rather than exploitation. The house that Jessica bought with her settlement money sat just 3 blocks from Tom's expanded business, close enough for Lucas to walk over after school to help with homework and play with Hope in the small garden that Jessica tended with therapeutic dedication. Their relationship evolved naturally from crisis intervention to genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting vulnerable people from the kind of predators they had defeated together. Years later, Lucas would tell people that the scariest night of his childhood had also taught him the most important lesson of his life. Sometimes doing the right thing required risking everything, but the alternative was living with the knowledge that you had failed someone who needed your help when it mattered most. Jessica established a foundation that provided legal support and safe housing for victims of family-based sexual abuse, using her own experience to guide other survivors through the complex process of escaping and prosecuting their abusers. The organization grew into a regional resource that saved hundreds of lives and changed thousands more. Tom and Jessica married 2 years after Hope's birth, their wedding a celebration of survival and authentic love that took place in the community center where Lucas had learned to play chess. The ceremony was attended by FBI agents who had become friends, fellow survivors who had found their voices through Jessica's courage, and neighbors who had learned that heroes sometimes wore work boots and carried wrenches instead of badges and guns. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.